Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support. Welcome to episode 2 of the John Calvin podcast. In the last episode, we were getting to grips with Calvin's context and how he now finds himself forced to flee Paris at 25 years old because of a crackdown on evangelicals started by Francis I. This was in response to a ballsy but perhaps ill-conceived attempt by some evangelicals to post anti-Catholic tracts across the whole of France, including rather audaciously the king's own bedchamber. In the end, this leads King Francis to end his tolerance of reforming ideas in France and to start seizing books and burning Protestants at the stake. Calvin, at some point, we don't know exactly when, has shifted from the scholarly humanist crowd we were talking about in the last episode into the Reformed camp during this period. And we can see this, for example, in the fact that in 1534, Calvin goes back to his hometown of Noyon, and he dramatically and courageously, I think, resigns the church livings which have supported him throughout his education. His father had managed to secure a deal with the church authorities that Calvin's education would be covered by the church. So from the age of 12, Calvin has been supported by these benefices. But Calvin seems to have decided, we don't know exactly why, that he wants to resign these benefices. It's reasonable to speculate that this is most likely explained by the fact that Calvin has now properly decided that he can no longer in good conscience kind of benefit financially from a corrupt church as he sees it. So that's a potential key turning point for him, this resigning of these benefices, and him starting to align himself less with the humanist camp and more with reformers like Martin Luther. So Calvin has fled France at 25 years old. He's landed in the German-speaking city of Basel, and somehow he now needs to find his feet as a young man. He can't speak German, which ends up being a barrier for him. He can only speak French and Latin. So already you get the sense that this must have been a disorientating time in Calvin's life. Add to that his journey there itself has been far from straightforward, to put it mildly. So during the journey, one of the servants steals one of the strongest horses and also steals nearly all of their money. The other servant sounds like a much nicer guy. He feels bad for Calvin and his travel partner, so he lends him 10 crowns, which enables him to complete his journey and to get to Basel. But Calvin would have arrived in Basel exhausted and stressed by all of this. With the coming and going of exiles, Calvin comes to hear about the disturbing persecution of evangelicals by Francis, and it is this horrendous and terrifying persecution that Calvin says leads him to write his greatest work of theology, the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which we will be looking at in future episodes in more detail. But it's a time of great upheaval, and even though Calvin has arrived in a city which has formally embraced the Reformation, it is still very recent, and there's a real tension, and the risk of violence is constantly bubbling away in the background. There are also, quite excitingly, secret agents working for the Catholic Church and the king in the city. So, for example, Calvin comes to hear about the poisoning of the great preacher Pierre Viret in Geneva. So he's reached a safe city of sorts, but things are far from safe or clear for Calvin. This is a brutal time, when to be associated with reforming ideas led many people to a violent and horrible death. So just to give you an example, there's an account of a burning in France by a German Catholic student, the fantastically named Eustoch Nobelsdorf. I love that. Nobelsdorf goes on to describe the horror and fear that Protestants faced in France, and he says this, it's quite moving. He says, "I saw 2 burnt there. Their death inspired in me differing sentiments. If you had been there, you would have hoped for a less severe punishment for these poor unfortunates. The first was a very young man, not yet with a beard, He was the son of a cobbler. He was brought in front of the judges and condemned to have his tongue cut out, ouch, and burned straight afterward. Without changing the expression of his face, the young man presented his tongue to the executioner's knife, sticking it out as far as he could. The executioner pulled it out even further with pincers, cut it off, and hit the sufferer several times on the tongue and threw it in the young man's face. Then he was put into a tip cart, which was driven to the place of execution. But to see him, one would think that he was going to a feast. And then a bit later, when the chain had been placed around his body, I could not describe to you with what equanimity of soul and with what expression in his features he endured the cries of elation and the insults of the crowd that were directed towards him. He did not make a sound, but from time to time he spat out the blood that was filling his mouth, and he lifted his eyes to heaven as if he was waiting for some miraculous rescue. When his head was covered in sulphur, the executioner showed him the fire with a menacing air, but the young man, without being scared, let it be known by a movement of his body that he was giving himself willingly to be burned. So you can hear in that rather moving and gruesome story that this is a dangerous time to be openly questioning the church, and it's a dangerous time for Calvin. And so we've got Calvin in Basel hearing these horrible stories of persecution. A number of factors come together that end up landing Calvin in Geneva. The first is that in July 1535, Francis I temporarily allows evangelicals back into France, but only if they renounce their beliefs within 6 months of returning. And of course, Calvin seizes the opportunity to return to his homeland. He has no intention of renouncing his beliefs, but he takes the opportunity to kind of wind up his family and financial affairs in Noyon. After doing this, Calvin intends to go to Strasbourg, the city of the famous reformer Martin Bucer, and with whom Calvin would maintain a close friendship throughout his whole life. However, Calvin doesn't make it to Strasbourg because at this point Francis I is at war with Charles V, the emperor, and the movement of troops means that Calvin has to take a different route going south. And this famously lands him in a city which has rightly come to be associated with his name, the Swiss city of Geneva. And by the summer of 1536, Geneva has formally rejected the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and they've been able to do this basically because of military support from the Swiss Confederation, and specifically Bern. And Bern allows Geneva to carry on being basically an independent city-state. And it's at this point that we see one of the most fascinating and fiery friendships develop between Calvin and a fellow Frenchman currently living and ministering in Geneva, Guillaume Farel. We'll be doing a series of episodes on Calvin and Farel's relationship in the future because it is just so interesting and hilarious at times as well. Farel meets Calvin and he senses that in Calvin he now has someone with the drive and the mind and the kind of shared convictions, really, not just to overthrow popery, but also to construct something, to build something, a church that's going to be like the Church of the First Apostles. Farel tries to persuade Calvin to stay in Geneva. Calvin explains that he wants to find a quiet corner of the world where he can study, and this leads Farel into one of his most famous and influential moments. And recalling that exchange, Calvin says this: "Upon this, Farel, who burned with a marvellous zeal to advance the gospel, went out of his way to keep me. And after having heard that I had several private studies for which I wished to keep myself free, and finding that he got nowhere with his requests, he gave vent to an imprecation that it might please God to curse my leisure and the peace for study that I was looking for if I went away, and refused to give them support and help in a situation of such great need. These words so shocked and moved me that I gave up the journey I had intended to make." So Farel essentially threatens Calvin with fire and judgment from God if Calvin runs away. Calvin is absolutely terrified by this warning, and so he decides to stay and to try to reform Geneva into a Protestant republic. Calvin's first attempt to reform Geneva doesn't go down well. He's derisively referred to by the Genevans as that Frenchman. And eventually the church authorities so kind of resist the changes that Calvin and Farel are trying to make that they eventually get kicked out of the city completely. And increasingly, people come to realize that Calvin and Farel are not a good team and not a good influence on each other. That is, that they kind of egg each other on and push each other to be bolder and bolder in reforming the church. But in so doing, they move kind of too quickly and too insensitively so that they end up alienating the city council. Remember, at this point, Calvin hasn't had any pastoral experience. He's very green. He's not naturally good with people. He's in his late 20s, full of enthusiasm and passion for the Reformation, but kind of lacking in tact and maybe emotional intelligence. And so Calvin retreats from Geneva to Strasbourg to lick his wounds. And it's here that he's taken under the wing of the hugely influential German reformer Martin Bucer. And I think it's fair to say that Bucer's influence on Calvin is enormously positive. Bucer is very much like a spiritual father figure to Calvin. He's 18 years older than Calvin. He makes sure that Calvin gets a congregation of French refugees to pastor. He secures a teaching post for Calvin at the academy. Despite Calvin's kind of prickliness and lack of tact, Bucer clearly sees huge potential in Calvin and massively invests in him as a person. Bucer provides accommodation for Calvin in his own home. He introduces him to his circle of friends, and eventually he secures a house for Calvin with a shared garden so that they could easily meet and chat. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in those conversations. But in many ways, Bucer is the perfect mentor for Calvin. He's reformed and sharp enough for Calvin to say that he respects him. That in itself is actually quite rare for Calvin, who's very aware of his unique intellectual gifts and how clever he is. But Bucer is also emotionally and politically savvy in a way that Calvin is not. So he's very involved in getting the various factions of the Reformation in the same room to try to hammer out an agreement. So he's very much a politician, kind of like a centrist. He teaches Calvin that reforming the church is going to be a task that's going to require courage, yes, but that it's also going to take emotional intelligence. And in many ways, Calvin is wiser, better connected and supported by the time he's invited back to Geneva to be their pastor 3 years later. He's also, very significantly, married. Calvin marries Idelette de Bucer in 1540 after a series of hilarious and failed matchmaking attempts by Calvin's friends. Calvin, it turns out, is not an easy person to match up with a woman. So this is one of the key things of the Reformation, that ministers should be allowed to marry. And finding a match for Calvin was no small task. So he says at one point, I'm not one of those insane kind of lovers who, once smitten by the first glance of a fine figure, cherishes even the faults of his lover. The only beauty that seduces me is of one who is chaste, not too fastidious, modest, thrifty, patient, and hopefully she will be attentive to my health. Suffice it to say that no woman was found for Calvin on the first few attempts. But eventually he's introduced by his brother to Idelette, and all of the evidence that we have is that Calvin really loves his wife. When she dies, he says, "I have been bereaved of the best companion of my life." So that's a really key relationship for Calvin, which we can probably have an episode on in the future. But as painful as Calvin's first years in church ministry must have been for him, firstly having to flee France as an exile, then landing in Geneva by accident, only to be threatened with divine judgment if he doesn't stay, and then being kicked out of Geneva for doing kind of what he thought God had called him to do. He ends up for having 3 very happy years in Strasbourg, getting pastoral experience, being mentored, getting married. There's a real sense in which this period in Strasbourg is crucial for Calvin's personal growth and his maturity. And he will need all of this as things have got so bad in Geneva that they come grovelling back to him and they ask him to be their pastor again 3 years later. And this feels like a good time to finish this episode. Thank you so much for listening. When we come to the next episode, we're going to see how Calvin goes more and more from being this obscure figure to being, in many ways, the celebrity of the Reformation, up there with Martin Luther in terms of his influence and fame. And what he does to stamp his influence on Geneva is what the focus of the next episode is going to be. Such a fascinating time in history. Really looking forward to that, and see you then.